Welcome to the Impeach 47 podcast. I'm your host, and with me as always is our resident tax policy expert.
Hey there, glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, this is a big one. You are probably listening to this deep dive because you've seen the massive marketing campaign surrounding the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the OBBA.
Well, it's everywhere. The rallies, the press releases.
Right, the slogans repeated on loop across every cable news network. But when you step out of the bright light of a campaign billboard and into the dense, murky reality of statutory tax text, those clean promises tend to vanish.
They just evaporate. I mean, the gap between what the public was sold and what is actually codified in the law is it's staggering. We are looking at a classic case of legislative misdirection.
Yeah, and our mission today as independent journalists is to just cut through that noise. We're looking strictly at the facts, the math, and the structural reality of these policies to uncover what the law actually does.
Okay,
let's unpack this. Because to make sense of any of these slogans, we have to lay down a fundamental distinction first. We need to understand the structural difference between a tax exemption and a tax deduction.
That distinction is, well, it's the entire architectural foundation of this legislation. And it's really where the primary deception lies. So an exemption means that specific income is completely shielded. It is simply not taxed at all.
It's just removed from the federal equation entirely.
Precisely. A deduction, on the other hand, merely reduces the amount of your overall income that is subject to taxation. It is a totally different category of relief. And the reality framing our entire conversation today is that the highly publicized provisions for workers, the no tax on tips, the no tax on overtime, the no tax on Social Security, they are absolutely not exemptions.
They're deductions.
They are temporary, capped deductions. They all expire at the end of 2028. And crucially, they leave the heaviest, most regressive tax burden on working people entirely untouched.
Wow. Okay, so let's see how that plays out in hard numbers, starting with that first major slogan, right? No tax on tips. The plain English meaning of that phrase suggests that if you're a bartender or a server and someone hands you a $20 bill, you keep all of it.
Right. The federal government doesn't touch it.
That's what service industry workers heard. So what does the law actually dictate?
Well, the bill creates a federal income tax deduction capped at $25,000 per year, and it's only available for 4 years, so 2025 through 2028. And it features really steep income phase-outs.
Phase-outs? How so?
Yeah, so if you're a single filer, the deduction begins to phase out once your modified adjusted gross income hits $150,000. For joint filers, that phase-out starts at $300,000.
Oh, I see.
Make $1 over that ceiling, and this so-called universal benefit begins vanishing.
So a high-earning bartender at, like, a premium downtown hotel, someone pulling in significant wages plus tips, might get absolutely zero benefit from this provision.
Correct. Furthermore, the deduction only applies to traditional tipped occupations that the IRS specifically listed as customarily and regularly receiving tips before 2025.
Wait, really? So what about new jobs?
If you work a modern service sector job or gig economy role that didn't exist in the traditional tax code a few years ago, the IRS says you don't count. You are entirely excluded. But the biggest omission here, the thing that fundamentally shatters the slogan, is the payroll tax.
The payroll tax. If you're listening to this on your way to a shift, you already know this is a massive line item on your pay stub.
It's usually the biggest line item on a tipped worker's tax bill. Tipped workers still have to pay the 6.2% Social Security tax and the 1.45% Medicare tax on every single dollar of tips they earn.
And the legislation didn't change that at all.
Not at all. Plus, most states still tax those tips at the state level. So if a worker claims the absolute maximum $25,000 deduction under this new law, that worker still owes almost $2,000. $1,912.50 to be precise.
Wow.
Yeah. In federal payroll taxes on that very same $25,000, the payroll tax sailed through this legislation completely untouched.
Wait, let me push back on that a little bit. Even if it's a deduction, a $25,000 tax write-off is huge.
Yeah.
Are you telling me working class people won't feel that in their wallets? Because that seems like a pretty heavy benefit, regardless of what we call it.
Oh, they will feel it, but who feels it the most is entirely backwards. A deduction inherently favors higher earners. That's just how progressive tax brackets function.
Right.
If you have a $25,000 deduction and you are a worker somehow hitting the 37% tax bracket, that deduction saves you over $9,000. But if you are a typical worker in the 10% tax bracket, that same deduction only saves you $2,500.
Oh, I see where this goes. It's a paradox.
Yeah.
The lowest paid workers, The people who fall under the standard deduction and owe no federal income tax to begin with get absolutely zero benefit from this provision, because you can't deduct against a tax bill that doesn't exist.
That is the core mathematical reality of using deductions instead of exemptions. Let's look at a server making $30,000 a year in tips. Under a true exemption, which is what the slogan implied, she would owe nothing on that money, zero.
Right.
Under the OBBA, she deducts $25,000. She then pays her normal bracket rate on whatever taxable income remains. So if she falls into the 22% bracket, that deduction saves her $5,500.
Which is real money. I mean, it's not nothing.
No, it's a meaningful cut. Saving $5,500 helps. But calling that no tax on tips when she is still paying federal income tax on the remainder, plus thousands in payroll taxes on all of it, plus state taxes, that's purely marketing.
Yeah.
It's a partial discount, heavily restricted, and it completely expires in 2028 unless Congress actively renews it.
Okay, so if the tips provision is just hiding behind basic tax brackets, how does the overtime provision get away with the same claim? Because honestly, looking at our reporting, the math there is actually much sneakier.
Sneakier and far more restrictive. The overtime provision shares the basic limitations. You know, the 25 grand cap for joint filers, the 2028 expiration, the intact payroll taxes. But the real deception goes deeper into the mechanics of how the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA, calculates overtime.
Let's break down that calculation. How does the FLSA define overtime pay?
So when you work overtime under the FLSA, you earn time and a half. The deduction in this bill only applies to the and a half.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it only applies to the 50% premium above your regular hourly rate. Your base hourly rate during those overtime hours remains fully taxed, just as it always was. The bill doesn't let you deduct your overtime paycheck. It lets you deduct 1/3 of your overtime paycheck.
Let me jump in here because this blew my mind when we were pulling the numbers. It's like a store advertising a tax-free sale on a suit. But when you get to the register, you realize only the tie is tax-free. You're still paying full tax on the jacket and pants.
That is a perfect way to put it. Let's look at a registered nurse. She earns $30 per hour as her base rate. She pulls a tough shift and works 10 hours of overtime. Under time and a half, she gets paid $45 per hour for those 10 extra hours.
Okay, so her total gross overtime check is $450.
Right. But the deductible portion is only the $15 per hour premium multiplied by those 10 hours. That's just $150. The remaining $300 of that overtime check is fully taxable wages. And the campaign called this no tax on overtime.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because tying this deduction strictly to the Fair Labor Standards Act creates a massive blind spot.
Oh, absolutely.
By requiring FLSA W-2 overtime coding, this legislation entirely writes out the modern contingent workforce. Uber drivers, DoorDash couriers, freelance designers, independent contractors. We're talking about an entire segment of the American workforce that lives on irregular hours, grinding out extra shifts for premium pay.
And they receive zero benefit.
Zero. Because they're classified outside of traditional W-2 employment.
What's fascinating here is the sheer administrative burden this places, even on the traditional W-2 jobs. Even workers who legally qualify for this temporary benefit can lose it if their employers fail to properly code the overtime premiums on their W-2 forms at the end of the year.
Wait, so a typo can cost you the deduction?
Basically, yeah. Our data shows that countless small businesses simply don't have the sophisticated payroll software or the administrative capacity to separate the base pay from the premium pay on the W-2. If the employer doesn't code it properly, the worker can't claim the deduction. It creates an incredible friction point for working people trying to access a benefit that was sold to them as an automatic universal fix.
So we move from these legislative tricks, the partial deductions on premiums, the bracket math, the W-2 coding nightmares, to what looks like outright government-sponsored disinformation regarding the third big slogan.
Yeah, this one is wild.
The first two slogans relied on confusing mathematics, but the third relies on a completely false premise that the government itself blasted out to millions of Americans.
You're referring to the no tax on Social Security provision.
Yes, the July 3rd email. On July 3, 2025, the Social Security Administration sent an official email to millions of beneficiaries across the country. The email directly claimed that the new law eliminates federal income taxes on Social Security benefits for most beneficiaries.
Which caused a huge uproar.
Right. We saw immediate corrections from major institutions right after that went out. But the Tax Policy Center, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Fortune magazine, they all had to flag this federal communication as entirely inaccurate.
Because the statement was factually untrue, the bill doesn't change how Social Security benefits are taxed at all. It doesn't create a systemic exemption for Social Security.
So what does it actually do?
The reality is that it merely creates a $6,000 temporary deduction for Americans aged 65 and older. If you're a joint filer where both spouses are over 65, it's a $12,000 deduction.
And just like the tips and overtime deductions, this one has income ceilings blocking the way.
Steep phase-outs. Single filers are phased out between $75,000 and $175,000 of modified adjusted gross income. Joint filers are phased out between $150,000 and $250,000.
And it expires, right?
Yep. Just like the rest of the worker package, this senior deduction expires completely in 2028. The core formula used by the federal government to calculate taxes on Social Security benefits was never actually rewritten or changed.
I really want to push on how the benefits of this particular deduction are distributed. When we look at the numbers, who actually wins here? Because if the underlying formula didn't change, but there is this new $6,000 deduction floating around, someone's getting a tax break. Who is it?
This raises an important question, and we need to look at the analysis from the Tax Policy Center to answer it. Fewer than half of older adults see any benefit at all from this provision.
Wait, less than half?
Less than half. Most low-income seniors already owed no federal income tax on their Social Security benefits under the prior law. Their incomes were simply too low to trigger the existing taxation thresholds. As we established earlier, you can't reduce a tax bill that is already zero.
So lower-income seniors get nothing.
They get nothing. On the other end of the spectrum, high-income seniors are completely blocked by the phase-outs, so they get nothing.
So who's left in the middle? Who actually pockets the cash?
The only group that is genuinely helped is an upper-middle income band, roughly seniors making between $80,000 and $100,000. These are folks who were previously paying tax on a portion of their benefits, and this new deduction pushes some of them below the existing taxation threshold.
But the main system hasn't moved.
Right. The underlying mechanism for taxing Social Security remains firmly in place. The whole system is still there.
Okay, so follow the money with me here. This is the ultimate question. We've gone through the three heavily marketed worker provisions. We've established they are capped deductions, not true exemptions. They are phased out for high earners, they exclude the lowest earners, and they all expire in 2028.
Correct.
Because they are so limited, they only cost roughly $32 billion each. In the context of the federal budget, $32 billion is barely a rounding error. Yet the Congressional Budget Office projects that the one big beautiful bill will increase the federal deficit by $3.4 trillion over the 2025 to 2034 window.
That's trillion with a T.
Trillion with a T. If the worker provisions are just a drop in the bucket, what is driving a $3.4 trillion deficit increase?
The bulk of that $3.4 trillion deficit is driven by the corporate and wealth provisions buried deeper in the legislation, specifically making the 2017 corporate tax cuts permanent. This locks in the 21% corporate tax rate forever. The bill also permanently doubles the estate tax exemption, allowing generational wealth to transfer without taxation at much higher thresholds.
Let me stop you right there to make sure I heard that right. Permanent.
Permanent. These corporate and wealth cuts don't have caps. They don't have phase-outs based on how much the corporation earns. And crucially, they do not expire in 2028. They are written into the code for good.
And how is that massive deficit funded? Because legislation of this scale requires revenue offset somewhere. You can't just blow a $3.4 trillion hole in the budget without making cuts.
Well, to fund those permanent corporate cuts, the bill extracts revenue by aggressively cutting safety net programs. Over the next decade, the bill slashes $911 billion from federal Medicaid spending.
$911 billion. That's incredible.
Yeah. The Congressional Budget Office estimates this will result in 10 million more Americans being uninsured by 2034. The legislation also cuts SNAP food assistance and fundamentally restructures federal student loan programs to extract more revenue directly from borrowers.
So what does this all mean? When we connect the micro details to the macro reality, there is a brutal irony in the math here. Think back to that server we talked about earlier, the one saving $5,500, or maybe a lower earning server saving just $1,400 in 2025 from her tip deduction.
Yeah.
That very same worker, the one directly targeted by the campaign marketing, might be the exact person who loses her Medicaid coverage. She might be the one who loses her SNAP food assistance. The temporary 3-year deduction she gets on her tips is actively being used as political cover to pass permanent corporate tax cuts, and the safety net programs she relies on to survive are being slashed to pay for the whole thing.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, an unmistakable legislative pattern emerges. It's a structural playbook we see time and again. You brand a provision with a populist slogan that sounds like sweeping historic relief. You implement it as a complicated deduction, you cap it, and you phase it out at higher income so it photographs well as being targeted at the working class. But most importantly, you make it temporary so it sunsets. That ensures the political cost of renewing it happens years later, forcing those workers back to the voting booth to protect what little they got. Meanwhile, in the very same bill, you secure permanent, uncapped tax cuts for massive corporations and high net worth estates.
And someone has to pay for it.
Well, spot on. And you pay for both the temporary worker deductions and the permanent corporate cuts by gutting the safety net programs that working people depend on every single day.
The gig worker gets left out entirely. The traditional worker earning $35,000 a year gets a temporary deduction that evaporates in 3 years. The corporation gets a permanent 21% rate that saves them millions of dollars forever. The billionaire whose estate tax exemption was permanently doubled saves tens of millions in perpetuity. The worker's savings come with a strict expiration date. The corporate savings do not.
The slogans were named for things the bill doesn't actually do. The marketing called it an historic tax cut for the American worker. The mathematical reality proves it is a series of temporary restrictive deductions marketed as systemic relief, while the actual permanent systemic relief is directed entirely elsewhere.
It forces us to look at the structural power dynamics at play. We started this deep dive talking about the massive comforting text on a campaign billboard versus the murky, complicated fine print of the legislative contract. The billboard sold sweeping exemptions, but the fine print delivered temporary deductions. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you digest these numbers. When a bill's corporate tax cuts are written to be permanent, but the deductions for working people are deliberately designed to expire in 3 short years, consider what that reveals about who the legislation expects to be continuously lobbying Congress in 2028. The people with the resources to maintain permanent influence get permanent results. The people who rely on campaign marketing get 3 years of partial relief.
It's a stark reality to wake up to.
It really is. This is independent, unbought accountability reporting. You can read more at peach47.earth and subscribe on Substack. We urge you to follow the reporting on X, Instagram, Threads, and subscribe on YouTube at the handle @peach47. And you can wear the movement and support the research by getting hats, shirts, and stickers from impeach47.earth. Keep reading the fine print. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.